We're starting a new series here, Cora and I. We're going to whether it's books or articles or just some idea that we had while we were doing something, but you sort of having a conversation about some artifact. We don't really have a name for it yet, but to kick off, Cora had a great idea that we should check out a book from some of our former coworkers called DevSecOps in Practice with VMware Tanzu, which I read through it, and it was a great overview of the different components of Tanzu and what they do. What about yourself, Cora? How would you kind of summarize this book?
Well, so I mean, in the title, you have this idea of DevSecOps, right, with a particular product coming from VMware. So the breadth of it is quite wide, touching the interests of developers, of operations, of security, and sort of this idea of managing software end to end. With a platform that's built on top of Kubernetes. And so the book does a really great job. I really enjoyed reading it as well. It does a great job of laying out what the challenge is at every stage in this end-to-end process. Challenges for developers, challenges for operators, challenges for security teams. And it just kind of goes step by step, presenting the answer to that problem from within the Tanzu suite. And so Tanzu itself is a platform that is an opinionated, curated, and integrated sort of coalition, I guess, of built on top of a lot of open source projects. And so the book is divided into 3 sections: build, run, and manage. So in the first section of the book, it talks all about building applications. In the second, it's more about how you get them to runtime and that initial runtime platform. And then the last part of the book is about managing them at scale. When you have many Kubernetes clusters, many applications running on many clusters, how do you actually do that as an organization? So I think it brings to the forefront this idea of what do we mean by a platform in this modern day and age? Because it does, a platform today, I think, addresses the needs of developers working to manage a lot of different applications and APIs and collaborate, and then the actual pipelining, moving of those applications securely and reliably to production, and then making sure that everything is running in production well, and that you know what's going on there across a fleet of Kubernetes clusters. But I think the book, it covers all of that. It describes the problem in general, and then it shows you the solution that VMware is offering through the Tanzu suite. It does a great job of all of that. So yeah, I really enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to talking to the authors.
Yeah, and as you're saying, right, like there's if you break down the process of getting your software into production, figuring out how to package and container and containerize it, all the stuff, more or less aside from coding, like there's a little bit involved in coding when it comes to like the gateways, the API gateways and things like that you would use. But it's mostly about the running of your application and the way that it's configured and the way that it goes through the factory of how you're creating it. There's a whole bunch of components involved in there, and they do a great job of kind of identifying all those components in a cloud native app and describing the different components of the Tanzu portfolio that addresses it. And also at the beginning, it's great. We get a 5th guest that was very excited about a squirrel,
yes,
which I enjoyed. First, let's have the 2 authors introduce themselves.
So we'll start with myself. Thank you, Cora and Kote, for giving us this opportunity to be here. I'm Parth Pandit. So to introduce myself, I started my journey as a developer beginning in 2002. And since then, I organically grew from a developer to a kind of project management. And then eventually, based on my technical areas of interest, I jumped into the world of architecture. And then I was fascinated by how the cloud ecosystem was evolved in 2015, 2016, and then jumped into that area. And I got a fascinating opportunity to work with Pivotal in 2018. And I learned about like how you can scale and deploy thousands of containers on a platform like Cloud Foundry. And then eventually Cloud Foundry grew into the other side of the container world. We know it as Kubernetes, and Tanzu came up to the surface. So had a very good ride with VMware Tanzu for a couple of years with VMware. And then just about the time when this book was published, I got a bittersweet moment where I got an opportunity to be a cloud architect with AWS. So I thought to even explore this public cloud domain, whereas I was mostly working in the private cloud domain with Tanzu and Pivotal Cloud Foundry, and I grabbed that opportunity. So that's where we are here, mostly working in the architecture space around keys, containers, and cloud ecosystem. That's me, Parth. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Parth. And the fifth participant in our conversation today is a completely out of control doodle puppy that I have no control over. So apologies in advance. I'm Rob. Like a lot of software people, I have a degree in saxophone performance from the University of Rochester.
Wow.
Quickly learned that was not a viable way to navigate life touring around. So I taught myself Java. I got my first coding job at a grocery retailer, a big presence in one of Kote's former hometowns. Worked my way kind of to the top there. That was, and after about 16 years, it was time to do something else. I got a call from a recruiter, so I checked out the company on YouTube, and there was this hairy guy in Austin talking about changing how you write software. And I thought, this sounds pretty intriguing. So I jumped over to Pivotal, where I got thrown into the deep end and learned a lot in a very short time, and kind of got a front row seat at kind of changing how witnessing and helping some household name companies, change how they build and deliver software. So yeah, that was a huge change for me. And, I kind of witnessed the evolution from Cloud Foundry kind of, morphing into Kubernetes, and then kind of landing at, what we now think of as the Tanzu portfolio. So this kind of rolling series of ever increasing abstraction, kind of going from, bare metal containers to cloud to, container orchestration like Kubernetes, and then finally to kind of a completely realized platform like Tanzu. So, that's kind of how I landed where I am.
There was this period in my daughter's life when she was maybe, let's say, 2.5. And every time my wife and I would start talking, my daughter would just start talking her babbling talk, like just, no words or nonsense, just kind of keeping up with us. And so I feel like that was a, as they say, tour de force of professionalism to give your introduction while the dog was in the background. And it also reminded me of that cute period in my daughter's life where she was just like, I'm gonna join into this conversation.
Nice. I was like, are you comparing your daughter to a dog? Is that where you're going? Thank you. Golden doodles it's a golden doodle?
There's a labradoodle, but yeah, she's gorgeous. But this is the most epic squirrel encounter we've ever had. So
she's so excited for you. She's like, you wrote a book. This is amazing. Speaking of which, I'm curious because, normally you go to the bookstore and you pick out a book and you don't know the author, and you put them on a pedestal. I still put you two on a pedestal, but it's amazing to know the authors, right? And to know that they're your colleagues. So I'm always curious about, what inspired you to write a book at all? What inspired you to write this book? And what was that process like? And I don't know, what did you get out of it? Maybe if you got something out of it that you didn't expect.
Yeah, let me take that up. So it all started from it was a kind of rippling effect when I participated in a global competition that we had internally within VMware to build and deliver a demo of end-to-end Tanzu vision. And I think I did a good job in that, and marketing team noticed that, and they approached me that, hey, do you want to write a blog about what you have built? An end-to-end story about how Tanzu is solving the problem of DevSecOps, the supply chain, for every step of the development journey. So I wrote that blog on VMware, and that was noticed by the PEC publication that this is a good narrative of what this technology is about. And there wasn't any book in the market. And being them, the publisher, they approached me that, do you want to write a book about this thing? Just expand this whole blog into a book and put more details into it. And I was like, Yeah, well, I can't because that was the first time I have ever thought about writing a book. I never thought of yes, it was always a kind of to-do list and wish list that I wanted to do, but this was it. And I was nervous at the same time because I didn't do that. And it's a huge amount of work. So I and Rob partnered before in few projects that we did together, and I have a huge respect for him, and he's always dependable. So I approach him, would you like to partner with me? This is the opportunity in front of me, and I don't think I can do it alone. Let's do it together and divide the work, and we can give good justice to it. And that's where we are.
I'll add a little bit of color commentary to the Rob Parth dynamic. So the way that we were teammates at VMware for quite a few years, and the way that we generally operated is that Parth would call me up and he'd say, hey, I've got this thing I'm thinking of. It's going to be 5, 10, 100,000, 10,000 hours, nights and weekends, time away from family, no personal life. Life is going to be a perpetual chore for 3, 6, 9 months of your life. You want to do it? And I say, yeah, buddy, let's do it. But in retrospect,
good partnership.
Yeah, exactly. So that's, I think Parth would tell you that's kind of how we operated at VMware. And I think this was just the kind of the expression of that kind of working relationship, it's like the different presentations and customer engagements, proofs of concepts that we did at VMware, they all kind of culminated in putting all of our learnings and findings in a book. So yeah, that would be my contribution.
I think it's amazing. Like it's to start with a demo, and then that becomes a blog, and eventually that becomes a book. That's an amazing story, and I think it's like anybody out there who's listening who has this thought that they couldn't write a book, or it's too big of an endeavor. I think probably, I imagine a lot of stories are like that, right? You start with something small and that gets good feedback and you grow it, and then it takes another form, and eventually you get to places maybe you didn't imagine.
Yeah. It's such a tired expression, but really the blank page is your enemy, right? If you just sit down and write something, and get over that initial inertia, you'll be amazing at what I read through the book now and I say, did we really write all of this? Like, where did all that time come from?
Yeah. And then you also have the other depressing effect where you're like, I don't remember what's in this book.
Maybe I should read it.
And the other thing you go ahead.
Yeah. So just wanted to add one more thing into this mixture. Like, it would be unfair if I don't call out David Kramer, my ex-manager in Tanzu, who pushed me that this is a big opportunity. If you are thinking to let it go, don't do it. It doesn't happen often in life. Just go for it. I know it's huge work, but he pushed me and I eventually got into it. So big thank you to him. I owe him a lot.
Yeah, I second that. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Amazing. So, so as you were writing this book, who were you writing it for? What was the audience that you envisioned?
I had there's a few audiences in mind, but really, I had in mind 2015 Rob Hardt, honestly, because who I was writing the book for, because I was delivering software of, depending on who you ask, some degree of quality. I thought I was doing things right. I thought I was solving the right problems. And then, as your scale and scope increases ever outward, right? As I got, I got to pivotal at VMware and learn from people who were doing things at massive, massive scale that I never could have even imagined. These entire classes of problems start to emerge, right? Like, it's like you don't know what you don't know. And then you learn that, and then you realize there's another level of you don't know what you don't know, and then there's a level after that. And so having progressed through, 3, 4, 10, 12 kind of iterations of abstraction on abstraction, I thought, man, maybe there's some value in putting this on paper and sharing it with people who are in some phase of that journey, right? So you can learn what are the right problems to solve? What should you be focusing on where you're actually delivering value as a software professional? So, developer, security engineer, DevOps engineer, operations person, DevSecOps. Right? Those are our people, but really people that are in some stage of their journey and kind of increasing their value prop as an engineer.
You know, like y'all spend a little bit of time in the book kind of talking about what you just discussed, like the milieu, if I pronounce that right, that your ideal reader sort of stews in, to mix metaphors or whatever. But like, especially with the background that y'all both have, you know, and also having worked at a couple of different places working in this same industry, like, well, let me put it this way. When I think about like what we collectively here have done over the years, you know, at Pivotal and then in VMware Tanzu, like I'm 70% sure it's mostly for large organizations, but I don't know, right? Like I throw that out every now and then, that like to some people, and then often people come back and talk about like, well, I don't know, if you had 2 development teams, these things would apply as well. But like, I feel like, what would you call it? The floor, like the you must be this high to ride this ride, is like, you probably need 500 developers, 200. I don't know. Like that's the wrong way to gauge the pros that you have or the opportunities that lie ahead of you. But like what's especially after going through this and you know, seeing working at a new place, like what you're thinking about the type and scale of organization that something like a Tanzu applies to.
Parth, do you mind if I'll start this one off too? Because I had an observation about this based on, you know, so I moved kind of out of solutions architecture into a kind of core systems development engineering role now for, you know, a big cloud provider. So I'm kind of doing in practice what we were helping customers do at VMware and Tanzu, right? And I realized we're a small team, but our pipeline to engineer ratio, I think, is about 5-1, right? Like we're like maybe between 10 and 20 developers. And last night, I don't think anybody could even rattle off all our pipelines. It's probably 50 to 75 pipelines, right? So it's not necessarily even the number of developers. It's more of the scope of what you're doing. Because I think as engineers become more valuable, a smaller team of engineers is able to you know, take advantage of these various kind of force multipliers and operate at this massive scale and scope. So you might have a single team of 10 or 15 engineers, but they've got, let's say, 50 pipelines, you know, for the various products that they're, you know, managing. A tool like Tanzu is absolutely applicable to them, even though there's only 10 developers, right? Because the scale of what they're doing is so huge. And I don't think it's that uncommon anymore for small teams to be working on these kind of massive scale projects. So it's really, you know, I'd put it in terms as a unit of work. If you're doing CI/CD, like number of pipelines, right? So if you've got if you've got 5 pipelines, you can probably manage it. 10, you know, if you're a team of 10 guys and gals and people with, you know, 70 pipelines, you are, you know, you're probably kind of constantly scrambling, keep everything up to date, right? When a log4j comes out and you've got 70 pipelines, you've got to go check. All of a sudden your life becomes very unpleasant. So maybe the inflection point where it becomes really valuable is 20, 30 pipelines, right? Like where that kind of economy of scale really kicks in. Do you want to add anything, Parth?
Yeah, only a couple of thoughts here that today you might be small and you might not need that complex toolkit in your bag. It's about thinking what's possible, about thinking what problems lies ahead when you grow in scale and what problems that you may need to solve. So if you are small today, that's fine. I mean, we would say that just go through the book and see what are the scaling problems that you might encounter down the line and how this toolkit will help you solve them. So it's about doing the right thing from get-go rather than course correct yourself, starting on the wrong foot and then find out that, oh, we have been doing this wrongly so far, and this is the right way of doing it. This is how it can be done better.
I mean, it's interesting. You bring up in the book this idea that every time you solve one problem, right, you discover a whole or a solution to one problem. Sort of like catalyzes a whole new set of problems, right? If you're managing VMs, then containerization will solve your problem of managing VMs, but then that can explode into a lot of applications that you have to manage. And then Kubernetes is the answer to that proliferation of containers problem. So somewhere in the book, you also talk about, you say two things that I think were interesting. One is that Tanzu is the answer to the problems that Kubernetes has sort of unveiled, I guess. And then at another point, you say that Tanzu is sort of the next generation platform. And this conversation on whether or not this is only for large customers or large teams, it makes me think that probably in the evolution of Tanzu, I mean, I'd like you to speak in general about this whole idea of Tanzu as the next generation and the problems that Kubernetes unlocks. So we can spend some time on that. But it just made me think that as Tanzu has evolved, it solved those problems of managing things at scale that Kubernetes brought on. But at the same time, it created sort of a path the other way, where we're also now addressing sort of point needs that are per application, right? Like if you don't have to be managing 100 applications to have to make sure that your one application is totally secure, right? And so once you start looking at things at that granular level, it's hard to say this is only for customers at scale, right? It's sort of Tanzu maybe spreading its breadth so far out that it's no longer just for big scale companies. But so I know that was a lot. So I guess let me break that down for you. What are the problems that Kubernetes has brought on for us that we have to solve that even give Tanzu a reason to exist?
You're welcome to jump in, Parth. I always have something to say. So, okay. Yeah, that's a great question. So first off, your synopsis of chapter 1 was so much clearer than the actual text of chapter 1. So thank you for that. I'm going to probably record this, and maybe in the next edition, I'm just going to give the Cora version of it. But anyway, the problems that Kubernetes presents, you're exactly right. Like there's this sort of evolving consciousness, and this is why I say I wrote it for the 2015 me, because I feel like I've made a few evolutions. And one thing we saw, when we were back in the Cloud Foundry days, we saw a lot of customers doing Kubernetes, and Kubernetes was going to answer all of their, it's going to solve all their problems. And in the world of Hightower, Kubernetes is a platform for building platforms. So each individual software team was effectively building their own platform to deliver their product, right? Or if you're a team with 50 pipelines, each of those pipelines might have baked into it its own kind of mini platform for delivering that particular piece of functionality, right? And that is a waste of time and money and attention and brain cycles, right, to rebuild a platform every time. So the idea is, and as an architect at a big company, you think you're the guy that can build that one platform that will work for every team at the company, right? And I've met that guy at probably 15 different customers, right? We exist everywhere. The truth is that building platforms is really hard, and building a platform that A, works and delivers value, and B, will be adopted by all those different teams is extraordinary. It's a lot harder than it sounds, right? And so the secret sauce of Tanzu, where it solves Kubernetes problems, is that it's got all of this kind of collective culture and knowledge going all the way back to, the early Pivotal days, where we know how to write this kind of software that succeeds in an organization and checks all the boxes and everybody wants to use. So it is an opinionated set of components, right? So you can still configure the platform how you want, but it is a platform that sits on top of Kubernetes. So the Kubernetes is the platform for building the platform. Tanzu is an instance of a platform, an opinionated instance of a platform that sits on Kubernetes and tries to solve all those problems, right? So it's it's what we've all been saying for probably a decade now, right? Which is that like developers need to be delivering valuable software, not building platforms, right? So that's the problem, essentially the problem that it solves, right? The platform instance that sits on top of the platform for building platforms.
I guess so. From that perspective, if the other interesting thing is how as technology evolves, everything that we used to manage, again, as sort of like a pet. I hate this analogy. I hate the pet cattle analogy because, like, I just we should care about every cow in the herd as well. It's just is there another analogy that could replace that one?
I don't know. Maybe like bricks versus cakes.
So I have to think about that.
Wow.
I mean, lot of, if you got a bunch of bricks in your house, and if one of them breaks, you just get a new one. You don't name the brick. Whereas like a cake, you're like, if you're making a cake from scratch, there's a lot of effort put into this.
Okay.
And like, if you had one slice out of 10 left in the cake that you made by scratch, you'd probably be like, I'm not going to throw that away. That's my cake.
It's hard to replace. It's hard to, you can't just replace this. Yeah. Okay. So, bricks and cakes. So our app were cakes and we turned them into bricks with containers and so on. Where was I going with this? So our Kubernetes has been our latest cake. We take care of each Kubernetes cluster. Do you think, does Tanzu allow us to start to think about and treat Kubernetes clusters more like bricks or cattle?
I think my substitution doesn't work. We should move on.
But are we there? Are we, because we're managing, are we there where we can manage fleets of Kubernetes and we can, the way we think about a Kubernetes cluster becomes something itself more ephemeral, replaceable. We're not managing the cluster itself.
I'll take that, Rob. So, when I was developing my demos and talks to my customer when I was back there in Tanzu, I was giving one analogy them that we had containers, we had Docker. When they scaled, when they became thousands of them, we needed something to manage those containers. And that's where we have platforms like Kubernetes who is orchestrating these containers for us. Now, big organizations grew and they keep deploying Kubernetes clusters. Now, we are again in the same phase where you need something to manage Kubernetes cluster. And that's where we have that, because it solves that problem of scale, not for containers, but for your Kubernetes clusters. And that's where your Kubernetes clusters become your bricks. No matter whether you build your building in one cloud platform or other cloud platform or your on-premises data center, your cluster will be brick, and you can create as many number of bricks, put them wherever you want, build whatever type of buildings that you want using platform like Tanzu.
I love that. So I can't shut up this morning. I want to add just one more anecdote to that, right? So yeah, there are organizations out there that have rooms full of brick makers, as it were, right? They're very highly paid brick makers. Whereas, they could just call up the brickyard and just get a truckload delivered right now, right? And so the anecdote, and I hope I'm not casting aspersions at anybody, but we were at KubeCon, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 years ago, and there was a financial institution that wanted to get into the Kubernetes distribution space. And so I'm not throwing shade at anybody. It was just an observation I had. It was a financial institution. They're in the business of moving dollars around, and they were paying presumably a highly paid, good sized team of engineers to come up with, a Kubernetes distribution to kind of compete in the Kubernetes distro horse race. And the observation we hope that a reader of this book would come to is that Kubernetes is a commodity, right? It's like bricks. It's not a cake. Sorry, Kote, that's living forever.
All right. Well, that's fine. I just in case it's terrible, I don't want to be associated with it, but it looks like it's turning out well. So, I'll go for it. Wait, to attempt to jam two questions into one question here, going off what you were saying, you just added a rider to the first thing. What we keep saying platform, but what is a platform as far as in the practical world, right? Never mind what we think a platform would be. And I ask it this way because I read a lot of tech news stuff, and there's a lot of different people talking about platforms. And I always think I don't know if you actually have encountered them. It's just this theoretical thing. And so one, I'm curious, what y'all think of as a platform as far as what you're seeing people do. And then the kind of, part of that question is is Kubernetes part of a platform, or is it the thing underneath a platform?
It's the latter. And you've actually brought up, an interesting distinction, right? Even in the context of software, there are many different things that are platforms. So, Tanzu in particular is an enterprise production software platform, right? So I write a piece of software that takes a customer's information and generates a set of recommendations for what they might want to purchase, right? So I've got this piece of software. It's got an input and an output. So what a lot of people newer to software don't realize is when you're doing software in the real world, doing it as a profession, doing it at scale, doing it in a secure, responsible way, there are dozens and dozens of steps between that software leaving your desk to actually running in production, right? So a big telecom we worked with before we came in, they actually went and tracked it down, and it was 7 months and 72 steps for a piece of software to get into production, right? And so Tanzu is a platform in the sense that it is the means by which your software goes from the developer's desktop to delivering value in production. And there are not salaried human beings manually executing those 72 steps over the course of 7 months, right? So it is the set of building blocks that goes from A to B to C to Z to running in production that takes humans and human effort out of the picture, right? So I'm glad you brought up that distinction, because sometimes when you think about a supply chain going beginning to end, you don't think of that as being a platform, but I think that's essentially what it is. It's all the tools that enable those various steps to get to production.
Yeah, that's I every now and then I've started to think of as well after reading your book. What you just said popped into my head that maybe the primary thing is the supply chain, right? And everything else is to say things are under it or over it is too much of a layered approach to think of it. But it's
contributors. They're contributors or components in that supply chain. Yeah.
Right. And so what kind of what emerges from your book is that there's this supply chain. It's all the steps it takes from what are we used to say, conception to code to running. There's no C for running. And so all the activities, any sort of way that you automate or wrap things around that, or kind of second or third things removed that need to happen to have that supply chain running. A lot of that is just that's your platform. It's almost I don't know why we don't like to use the word factory, but factory is another good word for it, right? If you think that you're producing software, you need a factory that produces the software, which is why all of a sudden you care about cooling circular saws when what you're making is Barbie dolls or something.
There's one quote in the book where you say, this is really more, this is in the chapter about, in particular, Tanzu application platform. But you mentioned that, which is, one component, right, of the Tanzu suite. But you say that if you think of Tanzu application platform GUI, the UI, as the eyes and ears of the platform, then the supply chain choreographer would be the beating heart.
Yeah, that's exactly true. I'm glad you said it, because I would have reused those words, because that's sort of my go-to analogy. But yeah, that being said, we talked about things in the abstract, right? We should maybe talk about some of the things that actually compose that factory, right? And it's true. TAP, Tanzu application platform, is that beating heart, right? It is the assembly line going from one end of the factory to the other that's taking the code and delivering software into production, right? And you can think of the other pieces, right? So when it's running in production, maybe it needs to run on 5 different Kubernetes clusters across different cloud providers, right? Then you've got something like Tanzu Service Mesh, right? And then you need a single place to look at all of your metrics across 5 clusters and all your different pieces of software, right? And that is ARIA, because that is just ARIA now. Sorry, they did rename it recently. Sorry, to make sure I got the name right. And then you've got all of the the developer facing tools, the IDE plugins and the API gateway, right? And all the stuff that kind of gets you through the various phases. Yeah. So, yes, TAP is the beating heart. But all of these other things are stations in the factory that your product will pass through at some point of its life cycle. So
yeah, which is interesting, because when you think about the problems that Kubernetes has forced us to deal with, these problems of scale. On the one hand, of course, you need that beating heart, right? You need that thing that's going to move your apps into production securely, and that's a conversation in and of itself. once your apps are there, of course, you need all these sort of at scale eyes and ears on that end to make sure everything's working in the way that you expect. But then there's on the other end, on the developer end, you also need some sort of eyes and ears and portal to make this massive platform usable at a developer or at a team experience. And it's interesting because like the problem is actually much broader, right, than the problem of managing containers or clusters at scale. And it sort of like on this question of like, what is a platform? I think actually what is a platform is a moving target, right? It's the same thing as we solve one problem, we encounter another, we redefine what that platform is. And so I guess if you include this, maybe focusing a little bit on the developer side, the Tanzu application platform, GUI as the eyes and ears of the platform, how would you define, like, how do we think about a platform today? What are we trying to attain? And how is Tanzu answering that question for developers?
I'll take a quick stab of that, Cora, with one thing that I would like to say to the listener who are not very familiar. What Tanzu is, if you are getting that idea that, hey, it's just a pipeline tool, it's not. The pipeline and the choreography is just one very small piece of the entire platform. It's just one assembly mechanism, what Rob has said, which change your application from your desk to the production thing. But think about how you build your product. Think about how you package them. Think about after deploying into production, how you link that application with other application. Think about how you will get on top of your entire ecosystem of your products, talking to each other and see if they misbehave, putting the guardrails for your products or applications that you deploy to make sure that they play within the established boundary. All these controls and operation mechanisms for your end-to-end journey of your application from an idea to a running software, that's the whole idea of Tanzu platform. And TAP is one piece into it, which helps you move your built application from your desk to production.
Yeah. So I like what Parth said. It's not just the assembly line, right? Like if you look at a factory, first off, I love how we're describing everything through metaphor, right? So I'll keep going. This is maybe not a Barbie doll factory, but maybe it's like more like a Steinway factory, right? Like you have that assembly line, but not every Steinway piano is the same, like the one in Parth's living room there, right? That's a Steinway, but then there's like, every shape and size. You kind of think of that as software, right? And so it is an assembly line, but, it's not just stamping out carbon copies. That's where we add value as developers. But there's a lot more than that core assembly line, right? There are stations where people are doing quality control. There are stations where people are doing, creating the components that feed into that assembly line, right? So, TAP maybe is the beating heart, maybe the aorta or the left ventricle is something like build service, right? Like turning your compiled software artifact or your source code into a container image that can run safely in production is surprisingly difficult, right? Like it is very easy for people to poke holes in your container images, and to do something that passes muster and checks all the boxes is really hard to do. So like one component in TAP is build service, right? Based on KPAC. Right. Those kinds of decisions, right? Like, so now you have a team with 5, 10, 100, 1,000 developers that don't have to think about turning software into a container image, right? So that's one component in the assembly line that's part of a wider factory, right? With all these other components. So yeah, that's a great distinction Parth makes, right? It's the whole factory. It's not just the central assembly line.
And also like if being a listener, if you be thinking that, hey, anybody can build this kind of a pipeline. Yes, you can. And anybody can build this kind of a platform also. The question here is, should you do that? I mean, which business are you in? Whether are you in the business of building this platform, or whether you are in the business of lending money or providing telecom lines or groceries or what, right? So you have to pick your core business and let this kind of complex engineering away so that you can fully utilize that and devote that time that you have to add more functionality to your own applications that will bring more better user experience for your end user.
And that's sort of the build versus buy conversation.
Yeah,
right?
Go ahead.
It's like
exactly.
when does the economics shift? So you're saying we've shifted. We're not in the economic stage anymore where maybe it's economically or advantageous to use your own resources to build your platform. We, as an industry, we've moved past that till point, I guess is what you're saying. Is that right?
Yes, that's what. In history, people were a bit reluctant to buy this kind of products because they were proprietary. They were like, once you buy that, like heavy, hefty license fees and all that were involved into running those kind of platforms. But what if just platforms are built with all open source tools and technologies underneath? I mean, then the worry of getting logged into a proprietary technology would be a bit reduced. I would not say it will completely get eliminated, because vendor locking cannot be avoided in no matter what you do. It can only be reduced to a certain extent, and it can be reduced only when you use a tool and a platform that is built with all open source technology under.
Well, so there's we have talked broadly here, but that leaves the book as the fun place to go to find all the exact details and the components. And there are y'all probably have it memorized, but there's I don't know, 6 or 7 different components or like parts kind of running around that you would go into. But as kind of like the last the last question, at least that I have to go deeper than kind of the broad stuff we've been at, reading through y'all's book, I had this same idea that I have all the time. I read about builds that involve containers and developers. And it seems like it's a really bad idea to let developers build containers that you then deploy to production. It seems like a lot of the work that is done in Tanzu, but then everyone does, is all about hey, let's not do that, right? Don't let that happen. But my perception is that's the way everyone does stuff. So I don't know, I guess is that a good idea to let developers be building the containers that get deployed to production? Or is it a bad idea?
That's a great microcosm for the whole broad problem set, right? Let's talk about that one thing. So there are 2, I guess you could kind of very common developer character flaws that actually play into this thing, right? So we have the desire to be extremely clever and impress your friends, and then you have laziness, right? And so step A is you employ unbelievable cleverness and abstraction on top of abstraction and reusability, and come up with this amazing path to creating a container out of your code, right? And then you deliver that and you start using it, then you forget how it works. And everybody who interacts with it subsequently manifests the other character trait of laziness and doesn't go back in to see how this super clever way of building containers, actually works. And the net result is you get stuff running in production that you don't intend to be there, right? And so build service is creating containers, designed and built by the adults in the room, right? People not trying to be too clever, and people who aren't lazy and they're going to make sure that the right thing comes out the other end.
Yeah, lazy or just using time wisely, because you could have a very hardworking person reinventing a wheel, only to find out that they have to reinvent. Yeah. They have to resolve all the problems that are already solved.
By developers, I mean me. I don't mean in general.
I think developers are generally, just to add one thought on top of what Rob said, is that developers are generally they are responsible people, right? They don't do things lazily or I would say dropping the ball in terms of security and all. But unintentionally, there should be a mechanism, there should be a process in the organization to make sure that whatever they are building for their containers, putting inside their containers in terms of dependencies, the runtime version, the operating system and all, that is all in line with the organizational acceptance thing. And putting that guardrail and the process to review all those things is a very challenging stuff. Rather than that, what if we can have a mechanism where intentionally also somebody cannot put anything which is not approved inside the container? And that's where this concept of build service comes into picture, where it creates a framework where developers would not have to think about what will go inside my container image. The engine will itself identify what will your application need to run inside a container. And all that will go inside the container will come from all the approved libraries which your organization has checked and found usable in product. That makes sense.
I want to make sure that anybody listening, if they're wondering, I guess, should I read this book? I figure maybe we'll give them a little bit of a what they can expect to get out of it, right? So I just have sort of the table of contents in front of me. So I'll lay out that the book is talking about Tanzu, the suite, a whole set of products that VMware provides that are inspired by this problem of solving the problems that Kubernetes has sort of unveiled for us of managing containers at scale, but then also managing clusters at scale, and then managing developers at scale in a way. So enabling developers to be productive when the system behind them is running at this scale, but also there's such a high bar for security and for efficiency and all that stuff, right? So Tanzu is sort of like an answer to that. It's not only the platform that sits on top of Kubernetes, but it sort of expands its reach into all of that single pane of glass that you need in order to really manage it properly, and also the developer portal that you need so that developers can have a good experience in collaborating with other teams and managing their APIs and all of that stuff, right? It sort of reaches both ends of that gamut. And so if you're looking to read this book, I think you're going to two things I think that you get out of it are, one, obviously an understanding of how Tanzu in particular is going to solve these problems, but also just a really great, as you were saying, Rob, at the beginning, right? Like you talking to 2015 Rob, what are these problems? Like, how do you think about this? And it is for security people, and it is for developers, and it is for architects and I don't know, other roles, many different roles, because it lays out the problems from end to end, because it is this end-to-end solution. So it really has a wide breadth. And so while you will learn about how Tanzu and VMware solve these problems, you will also get a very clear, very insightful, and I have to say very fun, for me, I really enjoyed reading it, a fun explanation of what these problems are, why they matter. You'll maybe recognize them in your own life and be able to see how they can be solved. And you learn about a lot of open source software, because as you said, Parth, right? Like there's a lot of open source software at the heart of these components. And it is an opinionated delivery, an integrated sort of integration of these. So you'll also learn through those opinions, there is sort of like the view into what VMware considers to be the best practice to solving. So even if you don't use Tanzu, you've come to understand what VMware thinks are best practices for solving these problems. And so I got a lot out of this book. Just because the breadth is amazing, and the way that you explain the problem set before you get to the solution is engaging and so clear. And so, just to make sure that people understand what they can get out of it. Congratulations. Parth.
Thank you. So I just jumped in. One thing that I would like to say to our audience is that this book is not for you if you think that this book will give you a production grade deployment of the platform. It's not for you then. It gives you an idea of what Tanzu platform contains and gives you a way to have your hands dirty, just to play around and experience the technology and do some high level stuff like day 1, day 2 activities with different tools, how you deploy, how you do certain basic operations with that. It's certainly not to help you become production ready. For that, we have VMware documentation, which is your go-to place. And it is quite in depth to give you the best practices in terms of how you should run them in production. So just wanted to call it out for the audience to set the expectation here.
If your production system falls, you can't call Parth. You guys still call VMware.
That's right.
Well, I appreciate you two being on. That's great. And the name of the book again is DevSecOps in Practice with VMware Tanzu by you two. I think. Oh, look, you have there's even a 3-dimensional version of it, which is always fun to have. But yeah. I mean, I agree with Cora. It was good to read it over. It'll make you interested and exciting about the portfolio. So thanks. I appreciate you two being on.
You got it.
Yeah,
Enjoyed
thank
it
you so much. Yeah.
Thank you. We really enjoyed this conversation.